It seems like Eddie Hearn is hoping to succeed where Al Heyman failed, and that is by implementing a UFC model in boxing whereby you have one champion per division, and that would, I have to assume, be a situation where one promotional company presides over all these championship fights. So Eddie Hearn said, quote, "We do have too many belts, that's a given. It's not good for boxing at all. You look at the UFC model, which we're all very envious of, which is one promotional company, if you like, and one belt. That's where I want to get to in boxing. It's going to take a lot of work, but we're putting a blueprint together for that, and it's something we're going to be pushing hard for in 2021 as we continue to expand. What we do have to understand is that belts do matter. These governing bodies are steeped in history, so we can't forget that. The WBC franchise situation for me was a terrible move for the WBC, and I love Mauricio Suleiman. He's a friend of mine, but I just have to be honest. The problem with the franchise title is that franchise champions are untouchables. We can't have that many barriers to greatness. You have to give these young fighters and lions the opportunities to try and achieve greatness by chasing guys down. Mandatories are a pain for big champions. We need competitive mandatories. I wish sometimes Anthony Joshua didn't have to have a mandatory. I really want the Joshua versus Fury fight to be for the undisputed title. I've seen comments from their side saying the belts aren't important. The belts are important, and they are important for Anthony Joshua. He hasn't accumulated these belts and sanctioning fees over the years to just throw them away. The dream is to be undisputed." End quote. And in this particular article, it talks about the fact that Dana White of UFC fame has proclaimed that Zuffa Boxing is close to being announced. And I guess this is a promotional company that Dana White is setting up specifically for boxing. It says that he is in business together with Mayweather, somebody who he hasn't had the greatest relationship with over the years, but the partnership is yet to be announced. And he has said that the current boxing model is broken and the whole thing needs to be changed. Could it be that Eddie Hearn will be involved in some type of collaborative partnership with Mayweather and Dana White, whereby they're going to come together and try and implement this UFC model in boxing? Personally, at first, several years ago, when I thought about a UFC model in boxing, it sounded like a good idea. And that's how most fans seem to react now. They say, oh yeah, we need that UFC model in boxing. But upon reflection, I actually don't like it at all. I think that a UFC model in boxing could lead to a reduction in the amount of money that the top boxers are able to make. And I don't think that's a good thing. You see, in the UFC model, none of the boxers are bigger than the promotional organization itself, UFC. Whereas in boxing, there are several top-level fighters who are bigger than their promotional company. Canelo Alvarez is bigger than Golden Boy. I wouldn't go as far as saying AJ is bigger than Matchroom, but AJ is certainly bigger than Queensbury, Frank Warren's promotional outfit. Tyson Fury, of course, he's bigger than Queensbury. He's signed to Queensbury. He's bigger than them. And this is a great thing about boxing, because it is a bit more of a, I don't want to say, I don't want to focus on the unregulated part, but certainly from a business perspective, it's more wide open than something like UFC. And therefore, it might be more chaotic, but there's also more opportunity for fighters to become genuine superstars. Whereas with UFC, they really don't produce anywhere near as many superstars as boxing does. Because again, the UFC brand tends to be bigger than the fighters themselves for the most part. And this puts the fighters in a subservient position to the brand and to Dana White and whoever else owns the UFC. So I don't like that. I'm always somebody that tends to come down as pro fighter. And I like the fact that boxing is one of the few professions in the world where you can literally go from being absolutely nothing and nobody to becoming one of the most powerful people within that industry. It's one of the few places you can do that, and nobody's pulling your strings if you reach the absolute pinnacle like a Canelo Alvarez. He tells his promoter what to do. He, look at the way he's going at the zone and going at Golden Boy. That's how much clout Canelo has. You don't see that very often in something like UFC. And over the years, there have been so many fighters who have come out and complained about how they're underpaid in UFC and how the promoter, they pointed fingers at Dana White and said that he gets paid more than they do. That can't be right, people. It can't be right for a promoter to get paid more from a show than the main event fighter. That is totally wrong. I will never support that. Boxing fans, particularly in the UK, but worldwide to some degree as well, a lot of them are just miserable and they love to complain about anything. Whereas I've always been a glass is half full type of boxing fan. I guess some people might liken people like me to Ty from Arsenal Fan TV. Shout out to Arsenal Fan TV, by the way, because you got these two very famous people, Arsenal football fans on that channel. One of them is Ty and the other one is Claude. And Claude is always upset with Arsenal. Especially when Arsene Wenger was still the manager at Arsenal. He was always upset with Arsene Wenger and always angry at Ty because Ty was more optimistic and he was always looking on the bright side and he was a glass is half full kind of character. And although I don't want to ignore any issues in boxing, not at all. I highlight the issues myself. But at the same time, I'm not a misery guts like Claude, who's just constantly focusing on all the negative and blowing things out of proportion, making mountains out of molehills. I love boxing. That's why I've been a boxing fan since the 1980s when I was a kid. I'm still a boxing fan now. There was a guy who I used to chat to online, and he's one of these fly-by-night boxing fans. He's not a real boxing fan. And one day he said to me, don't you want to abandon boxing? Words to this effect. Don't you want to turn your back on boxing and just start following UFC instead? And I was like, no. He said, but why not? Because UFC put on better fights and this, that, and the other. And I said, look, I respect MMA. Those mixed martial arts guys, tremendous athletes, tremendous fighters. But I've always been a boxing guy. I always prefer stand-up, throwing hands, and the quality of punches in boxing is far superior to anything you're going to see in UFC. And I like punches. So again, it's no disrespect to UFC. I've got a massive amount of respect for MMA in general. But having been raised on boxing and having been a participant, boxing is in my DNA. I think about boxing combinations when I'm walking around. When I go to the gym, I enjoy punching things. I don't want to start kicking things. I don't want to grab someone and wrestle them to the ground and get them in a chokehold or something. It's just not something that appeals to me. I like stand-up throwing hands. I'm far too entrenched in boxing to ever turn my back on it. I love it. I love boxing. So all these people that are moaning about this and that and the other, I think they're just unhappy in their lives in general, to be honest. And they're just finding an outlet to express their frustration at, the world because their lives are unfulfilling. This is what I think is going on with a lot of people. I'm not saying everybody, but with a lot of people who are just so down about boxing constantly. I think that's a manifestation of unhappiness within their own lives and a lack of fulfillment. I think that's what it is. So for me, boxing is not perfect. There's always issues. There's always things that we have to discuss and indeed complain about. But for the most part, I love the sport. I'm happy with the fights that are taking place. And I know some people won't like to hear this, but in terms of the big fights, plenty of big fights happen in boxing. We just had Loma Lopez was a great fight. But again, this is the weird thing with a lot of boxing fans. They only focus on fights not happening and they ignore all the fights that do happen. Oh, there's been no good fights in boxing for ages. Hang on, didn't Povetkin and Dylan White just have a tremendous slugfest, which ended with a one-punch knockout out of the blue? What are people talking about? Didn't we just see Tyson Fury demolish Deontay Wilder in a big heavyweight title fight earlier on this year? I mean, did that happen only in my dream, or did that really happen in real life? Like, come on. What's all this hyper-focusing on negativity and the fights that are not happening? But anyway, the point I wanted to make is sometimes the controversy around a fight, who's ducking who, all this kind of business, can actually contribute to the excitement when the fight finally does happen. Because there's been so much back and forth between the fans. There's been so much anticipation. It makes the event bigger. You see, with UFC, the events are not as memorable as boxing events. They have great fights in UFC. Don't get it twisted. Great fights. But the build-up isn't as memorable because of the fact that the build-up usually isn't as long. And also because the fighters themselves are not as big in UFC as they are in boxing. Who in UFC is as big as Anthony Joshua? Who in UFC is as big as Tyson Fury? Who in UFC is as big as Canelo Alvarez? Yeah, they have big shows, but I'm talking about as individuals. They had Conor McGregor, of course, who was big. Ronda Rousey for a little bit, but they're anomalies. Normally in UFC, you don't get people that reach that level of prominence. Whereas in boxing, you've got these huge names, these huge superstars. And again, this is because of the fact that their rivalry is built up over a much longer period. And that they are the product. The fighter is the product that you're selling. You're not selling a promotional company as the product, like UFC. See, they name the shows UFC, 247 or whatever. They don't name it just based off the fighters' names. No, it's UFC 247. You understand what I'm saying? So they've made the promotional company bigger than the fighters themselves. So, yeah, in boxing, it is done differently than UFC. And there are pluses and minuses to both models. But overall, upon reflection, I prefer the boxing model. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying that it can't be improved, because it can. If we were to have one champion per division, but boxing wasn't under one promotional company, then I would support that. Okay? But having boxing under one promotional outfit and just exactly replicating what the UFC are doing, nah, that's bad for fighters. It might be good for fans to some degree, although even that is debatable, because in UFC, you've got a situation where the perception is whoever the UFC champion is at any given time is the best MMA fighter in the world. But that isn't necessarily true, because you have other MMA promotional companies like Bellator, etc. Who's to say that one of their champions isn't better than the equivalent UFC champion? People assume that the Bellator person isn't as good as the UFC person, but they don't know, because they don't have these cross-promotional, let's say, unification fights. They don't do that in MMA. So it's all based on assumptions and the perception that people have of UFC, because they're the oldest MMA company and they're the biggest, and they do have, I guess, the best talent trying to get contracts with them because of the fact that I'm assuming they pay more than Bellator and the other companies. But just look what happened with Andy Ruiz when he knocked out Anthony Joshua. Think about that in MMA terms, that the UFC guy could be Anthony Joshua, okay, the equivalent of Anthony Joshua in terms of his status within the sport. And then in Bellator, you have an Andy Ruiz type character. But in MMA, you're never going to see those situations happen because there's no cross-promotional fights happening. You see? I know that there are former UFC fighters who end up in Bellator and former Bellator fighters who end up in UFC. But I'm talking about when you have a top contender or a champion in Bellator, you don't see them fighting a top contender or a champion in UFC. It doesn't happen. So it's all predicated. This belief that the UFC champion is the best MMA fighter in the world is just a belief. It's predicated on belief. It's not predicated on actually that guy having to face the best fighters and the champions from all the other MMA companies in the world. You see? So it's a bit of an illusion. Whereas in boxing, you have these cross-promotional fights that happen all the time. So you can get to see who the best middleweight is or who the best heavyweight is. AJ versus Tyson Fury, they're with different promoters, they're with different broadcasters. When they come together, we're going to find out who the best is. So anyway, that's my take on it. But look, it is interesting to see what Eddie Hearn is going to try and do here, because he didn't go into specifics in terms of how he hopes to try and implement this, whether he's going to be hooking up with Dana White and Floyd Mayweather, and whether he will succeed where Al Heyman failed, because Al Heyman wanted to do this. He wanted to have a PBC champion, and he wanted that to replace all the sanctioning bodies. And again, at the time, I supported it. I thought, okay, yeah, this is a good idea. But upon reflection, when I thought about it more, I realized actually it's not a good idea and it's bad for fighters. So yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. It's happening. I'm out.